Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Well, I'm back after quite a hiatus, lots of things going on, none the least of which is trying to get some new equipment up and running and climbing the curve on learning how to use the equipment properly. But be that as it may, I'm back and we're going to continue on in our series. I have the next 3 sessions ready to film. Today I'm going to film Angels and Demons and hopefully get that up within the next couple of days. The next session in the Gospel of John, as well as the next session in the book of Revelation, is ready to go. So with that said, I hope you're all doing well. The warm weather is here and it's time to get out and enjoy the beautiful sunshine. But let's move on in our study here in Angels and Demons, and I'm going to begin with a brief review since it's been a while since we have talked about this. So you'll remember that this all started with this subject that I call the nature of the deep, or the nature of reality. So what is reality? We are confined for the present time in a 3-dimensional construct. And thus, it is only natural that when we conceive of reality, when we conceive of what is and what is not, we tend to calibrate it in accordance with our understanding of reality that takes place in 3 dimensions. And so if there is anything outside of 3 dimensions, if there is something more to the nature of reality than what we see, then we are what I call revelation dependent. That is, that the information must come from a source that is above or outside. Now, if you will go back to the first session on Angels and Demons, I put a couple videos up there, one Dr. Quantum and then the other one from TEDx, to kind of give us a basic primer on what it would be like to conceive of more than 3 dimensions. And so the revelation that comes from us has to come from a source that is outside or above us. And we know, because we espouse a Judeo-Christian worldview, that this revelation has been delivered to us by God. In the Old Testament, the Jews call the 39 books of the Old Testament the Tanakh, and we who are Christians refer also to the 27 books of the New Testament, together with the 39 books of the Old Testament, as the Bible. And so that is the source from which we draw our information from above, or our information from a realm that transcends our 3 dimensions. Then we spend some time looking at what we read about this from the perspective of the loosely so-called Abrahamic faiths, Islam. We looked at several passages in the Quran that talk about this concept, and then we looked into Judaism, some of the commentaries, some of the sages, what they said about this, and then we began to examine the biblical data. What I want to do today is I want to move on, and I want to begin looking at these beings here, or what I've been calling throughout this whole seminar, trans-dimensional beings. And so today we're going to look at cherubim, seraphim, and archangels, and then we will come back in the next session and deal with the subject of angels and demons. But I always want to reiterate the main point and objective of this study. It's not to satisfy curiosity. It is not to answer some unknown questions or to develop some sort of conspiracy theory, but it's to get us to realize that there is more to reality than what we can perceive. And the idea behind that is to get us to think eternally, to think with an eternal mind rather than a mind that just focuses on the here and now, what this short little grain of sand time span of a life that we have here on planet Earth. And so that's really what this is all about, and I'm going to keep hammering this home because it's really important. So as we begin here looking at these beings, cherubim and seraphim, I want to first point out what I believe to be categorical distinctions that we find in the Psalms And these categorical distinctions have to do with both the nature of these beings and their function. And so we read in Psalm 104, verses 1 to 4, and follow along with me, and I think you'll catch the drift of what I'm implying here. So we read, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, O Lord my God, you who are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, who cover yourself with light as with a garment, who stretch out the heavens like a curtain. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariots, who walks on the wings of the wind." And here's the part that I want to focus in on. "Who makes his angels spirits, his ministers a flame of fire." So we see two different terms here, I believe, referring to two different classes of beings. And so the first term is the term angels. The Hebrew word is malach. The Greek equivalent is angelos. And the function of angels, according to the lexicon, is to dispatch as a deputy or messenger, or that is, one who is sent off to a destination for a purpose such as delivering a message. And so the function here of angels is essentially a messenger, one who is sent to dispatch a message. But look at what it says about their nature. The Hebrew word is ruach, the Greek word pneuma, and it roughly equivocates to wind, by resemblance, breath, a sensible or even violent exhalation. And so angels, as messengers of God, carry the product of his exhalation, his word, his decrees, outward from his presence to a destination and timing of his choosing. We see this time and time again throughout the Old and New Testament. And so there we have both the nature and function of angels, or malach, or angelos, given to us here in this verse. Then notice, though, that it also names a second class of beings here, the ones who are called ministers. Now, if you'll notice here, both their function and their nature is different from that of angels. So the ministers here, the Hebrew word is shareth, and the Greek word is liturgos, from which we get an English word that we're familiar with, liturgy. So the function of these ministers is to serve, to wait on, to attend as a worshiper, which in turn implies close proximity to the one that they're serving. So to worship means to serve and wait on as an expression of reverence and adoration, specifically here within the context of temple service, in proximity to the earthly temple, the Ark of the Covenant, and as we learn in the book of Hebrews, the earthly tabernacle, the earthly temple, the earthly ministrations of the priesthood were all a copy and shadow of the true, which is in the heavens, wherever that might be. And so their function was to be in close proximity to the one that they were to serve, and their service was also an expression of reverence and worship, or included also an expression of reverence and worship. But notice here what it says about the nature. Lahat esh is the Hebrew word. The Greek word is pur philegon, which means burning or flaming fire, a scorching fire. So that's interesting. Notice the contrast here between the two. The angels have a nature that resembles wind or breath, or a gust, or an exhalation of breath. Whereas the nature of these ministers, as they're called here in Psalm 104, is that of a burning or flaming or scorching fire. So let's see if the scriptures actually bear out this distinction. So move along with me, and now we'll move to the first subject that I said we would consider, or the first nature of being, would be the cherubim. Now, about the cherubim, we read that they have a burning nature. That is the kind of essence here of the nature of cherubim. And the word cherub is without root or equal in the Hebrew language, or at least in the Hebrew language as it's preserved in the Bible. And so the BDB Theological Dictionary goes and looks at other ancient languages to see if somehow this name, this title, Cherub, was a derivative of some other ancient language other than Hebrew. And what they found was that there was the Assyrian bull. I think we're all familiar, with the statues and the stone carvings of these winged creatures that were guarding the city gates, and they equate roughly to the mythical griffin. Some of you may be familiar with that mythical creature, the griffin. Anyway, and then there is this other publication that, again, takes this term and applies it to one who is in close proximity and offers service and worship to the one to whom they are appointed to serve or to minister to. And so if we put this all together, this is kind of what we come up with. So the function of cherubim is a mighty created being who gives blessing and praise in close proximity to God. Their nature is that of a burning, scorching fire. Now there is one thing I want to point out here. There is not a single occurrence in scriptures where they are referred to as messengers and thus confused with angels, who apparently, whose nature and function is quite different. So now let's go on and take a look at the biblical data. So in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, first passage I want to consider with you, is we read, So he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. And so notice here that the word in the Hebrew is in the plural, which means that there are more than one of them. And these cherubim were placed at one end of the garden to guard, that is, to protect, to preserve, to observe, to obstruct entrance into the garden. Now, in the same passage, or a little bit later, we read that at the other entrance to the garden, there was placed there a flaming sword which moved every which way to block entry into the garden. And the Jewish sages taught that that was actually a manifestation of the Shekinah glory of God, that God himself was there guarding the entrance to the Garden of Eden, and thus guarding the way to the tree of life. So we see in the first passage, we see that there are cherubim and that there are more than one of them. Now we turn to Ezekiel chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, which is a continuation of one of the most mysterious passages in the scripture, which we will look at next. But in Ezekiel chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, we read, And I looked, and there in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubim, there appeared something like a sapphire stone, having the appearance of the likeness of a throne. Then he spoke to the man clothed with linen and said, Go in among the wheels, under the cherub, fill your hands with the coals of fire from among the cherubim, and scatter them over the city. And he went in as I watched. So now I wanted to start with this passage, because this passage in Ezekiel chapter 10 clearly identifies the creatures that we're going to look at next in Ezekiel chapter 1 as cherub. So let's move to Ezekiel chapter 1, where we read in verses 1 to 14. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, which was in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. Then I looked, and behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire, engulfing itself, and brightness was all around it, and radiating out of its midst like the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire. Also from within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. Each one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of calves' feet. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. The hands of a man were under their wings on their 4 sides, and each of the 4 had faces and wings. Their wings touched one another. The creatures did not turn when they went, but each one went straight forward. As for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man, each of the 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, and each of the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and each of the 4 had the face of an eagle. Thus were their faces. Their wings stretched upward. 2 wings of each one touched one another, and 2 covered their bodies. And each one went straight forward. They went wherever the Spirit wanted to go, and they did not turn when they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches going back and forth among the living creatures. The fire was bright, and out of the fire went lightning, and the living creatures ran back and forth in appearance like a flash of lightning. So now some observations, just some brief. There's just so much in this chapter. I've spent years studying it, and I am still mystified by what's in here. But just some obvious observations here. Notice that these creatures had 4 faces. Now, the only way that Ezekiel, from a point of view, from a perspective where he was standing in one place, the only way that Ezekiel would be able to discern that not only that each one had 4 faces, but what each one of those 4 faces were, was if each one of these 4 creatures was oriented around the points of the compass. Thus, the different faces would show, dependent upon what point of the compass they were stationed at around this central thing, which we will see is the throne of God. It says that each one had 4 wings, they had cloven hoofs, and you'll notice there it says that they didn't turn when they moved, which means they had omnidirectional travel capacity. And also it says that when they moved, it was like a flash of lightning, which in turn implies that their movements were supersonic or so fast that their movements were as the flashes of lightning. Now, I want to point something out here that takes us a little back into the book of Exodus, and the scene is Mount Sinai. And we read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 18, "Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off." So we see the same natural or supernatural phenomena taking place on Mount Sinai when the glory of God descended down upon Mount Sinai to give the law to Moses and through him to the Jewish people. Now, notice here that it also says that the cherub, when we look at, remember back to the Ezekiel chapter 10 passage, the cherub were oriented above the whirling wheels. And just to recap that, we read in Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 2, "Clothed with linen, and said, 'Go in among the wheels under the cherub, fill your hands with coals of fire from among the cherub, and scatter them over the city.' And he went in as I watched." Another passage in 2 Samuel, chapter 22, verses 8 to 15. We get some more information that sheds some light on the nature of this phenomena. We read, "And then the earth shook and trembled, the foundations of heaven quaked and were shaken. Because he was angry, smoke went up from his nostrils, and a devouring fire from his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also, and came down with darkness under his feet. He rode upon a cherub and flew, and he was seen upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness canopies around him, dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him, coals of fire were kindled. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. He sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning bolts, and he vanquished them. So here now we have this passage of Scripture that gives us the relative position of God as it pertains to the cherub. Here it says that he rode upon a cherub and flew. Now, if we were to dig deeper into the Ezekiel chapter 1 passage, we would see that the whirling wheels and the four living creatures, which Ezekiel chapter 10 identifies as cherubim, are actually supporting and carrying, or the throne of God is situated above the living creatures. And so we find that it coincides with what we read here in 2 Samuel chapter 22. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to move on and see how Lucifer is related to all of this. So we actually see something really interesting here in this passage in Ezekiel chapter 28. Now, the structure of these chapters in Ezekiel actually speak about the judgment that God is bringing down upon the surrounding nations for the way that they were treating his chosen people, Israel. So as you move through the different nations, what you'll notice here is that the condemnation and the judgment begin with a judgment that is being brought down upon the earthly ruler or the earthly representative of the nation. But then it moves on past that and it looks through or above to the spiritual entity that is driving the harsh treatment that is being visited upon the people of God. And so we see this in Ezekiel chapter 28, where we will read starting at verse 12. The first half of the chapter talks about the earthly ruler of this nation, and then it moves on and it speaks to the spiritual entity that is sort of pulling the strings and calling the shots, as it could be considered. Anyway, in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 12, we read, "Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you are the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You are in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald with gold. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day that you were created. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of the fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day that you were created, till iniquity was found in you. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones." And so you'll notice here that Lucifer in this passage is referred to as the anointed cherub, the Mipshak, or the one with outstretched wings. And the word covering there, covering cherub, means to fence in, to cover over, to hedge in, to defend. And it sort of gives the sense of an intertwined mesh and web blocking access to the throne. Now you'll notice that there's a lot of similarity here to what we see described when you look at those passages in the Old Testament that talk about the construction of the Ark of the Covenant, that on the lid, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, was the mercy seat, and then on to the left and right of the mercy seat were two cherubs. So what this implies is that there were two covering cherubs, or two cherubs who had their wings outstretched and covering the mercy seat. So if this is correct, and if you take this and add the other four that were stationed around the perimeter, we're up to 6 cherubim thus far. Again, this is just my opinion, but it's something that I have observed as I have studied the scriptures. Now let's move forward into the New Testament, into the book of Revelation. So now in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, we get some more information now as the nature and function of these beings are further revealed to us in the New Testament. So in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, we read, "After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me and saying, 'Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this.' Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardis stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the throne proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and back. The first living creature was like a lion. The second living creature was like a calf. The third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. The 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they do not rest day or night, saying, 'Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come.' Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever." And so now we have further information on these living creatures. It tells us here that they were full of eyes, front and back. Now, in addition to being omnidirectional, what we learned from the Ezekiel passage, we see that they had omnivision. And you'll notice here that John's point of view is very similar to Ezekiel's point of view. And so they had eyes all around, and they were stationed around the throne, or from the circle round about, around the perimeter of the throne. And it also says, and within. And so that is inside, inward. So to give you a sense of what that word within means, I wanted to give you a verse that kind of helps us understand how that word is used here in Revelation chapter 4. In Romans chapter 8, verse 23, we read, "And not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly awaiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body." And so the word within there means internal to us. And so bearing out what I said at the beginning, these cherubim are located in close proximity to God on his throne. Going back to Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 18, we read, "As for their rings, they were so high that they were dreadful, and their rings were full of eyes round about them." And so here we have this very similar description given. But here is where it gets a little bit confusing, because in this passage, if you compare it with the passage in Ezekiel, you'll see that these living creatures have 6 wings. Now, one thing I want to point out here that might help to explain here this discrepancy is that John's perspective was the same as Isaiah's perspective, and we're going to look at the Isaiah passage here in just a minute. That is, in their respective visions, they were in the throne room of heaven. Thus, they were outside of time, space, dimensional spheres of restriction. Or, in other words, in their visions, they were transported outside of a 3-dimensional realm into what I believe would be at least a four-dimensional space. Whereas in Ezekiel's vision took place within a 3-dimensional time-space dimensional restriction. You'll remember in the Ezekiel passage, the glory of God, the cherubim and the wheels, descends and comes into the 3-dimensional realm. So we have that might explain why in the transdimensional vision here in Romans chapter 4, there are 6 wings in view rather than 4. But let's take a look now, and let's move on and look at seraphim, and we find some similarities and some dissimilarities as we move into the second class of beings, or are they really second class? This is a big mystery. Be that as it may, we read about seraphim that they have a burning nature. The word seraph means burning, fiery serpent. And this class of heavenly beings mentioned only once in the Old Testament in a vision of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah saw several seraphim, their exact number not being given, standing before the throne of Yahweh. They were winged beings, each having 6 wings, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, and 2 for flying. The seraphim cry continually to each other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." The same declaration of praise that we read in Revelation chapter 4. The whole earth is full of his glory. The foundations of the thresholds of the temple were moved by the sound of their voices. One seraphim flew to Isaiah with a live coal in his hand, and he had taken with the tongs off of the altar with which he touched the lips of the prophet to purge him from sin. Okay, so just dropping down here a little bit, I want to move to the end here. Nevertheless, it may be concluded from the description that the seraphim were conceived as having human faces, human hands, and human voices. However, one should not hastily conclude that the seraphim were winged human forms. At least this was not the original conception. And then they're spoken about again in the apocryphal book of Enoch, where they are designated as serpents and are always mentioned in conjunction with cherubim as the heavenly creature standing nearest to God. So the passage cited furnished conclusive evidence against the idea, popular for a time, that the seraphim belong to the same category as angels. They have nothing whatever to do with the messengers of God. In the Jewish conception, the two have always been distinguished. And so here we see in this Jewish commentary on the passage that the Jewish sages made a clear distinction between these beings and angels. Okay, let's move on and look a little deeper here into these ministers of God, the seraphim. Now we read in Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 to 7. "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple, and above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. So I said, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me. I lost my place. For one of the seraphim flew to me from the having in his hand a live coal which he had taken with the tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth with it and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is purged. So here again we see the seraphim in close proximity to the throne of God. And we see similar vocal effects here as in Ezekiel and in Revelation chapter 4. The language here is Hebrew. That is that they were declaring, which Isaiah, we know that it was Hebrew because Isaiah understood what they were saying. So this is apparently the heavenly language and the first human language. It was Hebrew. So they shook the doorposts of the throne room, filled the house with smoke, and they communicated with one another and with Isaiah. Now, as I mentioned before, John's point of view relative to Isaiah and Ezekiel's, here we have Isaiah's position relative to the throne. One of the seraphim retrieves one of the burning coals from the altar, or that is the altar of burnt offerings. And so if we go back into Exodus chapter 40, verses 1 to 7, we learn something about the copy and shadow of the heavenly altar of burnt offerings by looking at the copy and shadow, or the earthly one. So we read in Exodus chapter 40, verses 1 to 7, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, On the first day of the first month you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. You shall put in it the ark of the testimony, and partition off the ark with the veil. You shall bring in the table and arrange the things that are to be set in order on it. And you shall bring in the lampstand with its light. You shall also set up the altar of gold for the incense before the ark of the testimony, and put the screen for the door of the tabernacle. Then you shall set the altar of burnt offering before the door of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. And you shall set the laver between the tabernacle of meeting and the altar, and put water in it." And so this is obviously referring to the sin offering. So there's a lot that we can learn about the true tabernacle in the heavenly places, the true mercy seat, the place where the cherubim are stationed around the throne and the seraphim above the throne. By looking at the earthly, I believe that's why God put it there. He wants us to study it intently and to gain at least a shadow of understanding. And we read the proof of this in Hebrews chapter 8, verses 3 to 5, where we read, "For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Therefore it is necessary that this one, Jesus, also have something to offer. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve the copy and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, 'See that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain.'" So Isaiah could neither approach the throne or hear God's voice until after his sin and iniquity was removed. Okay, so there we have it. We have some things to figure out. We have some things to study. And I have more slides in this presentation, but I think I'm going to hold it there for this session because there's a lot to look at, and I want to encourage you to take these slides, to take the Bible references, to use the wonderful tools that we have at our disposal today. We have Bibles galore. They're all over the place that we can open up. When all of these things were recorded in the scriptures, people didn't have Bibles. There were scrolls, and scrolls were very expensive because they had to be handwritten, and the parchment and many times the leather skins that they were written on were very expensive, and so they would go places and have to sit and listen to someone read the words of God. But we have it all here available to us, and we have all of the internet capabilities, which can be a tremendous force for evil, but it can also be a tremendous force for good if we use it in a right and healthy way. And so I want to encourage you to do that over the next few days as I prepare to continue on with the study, so that you're kind of catching a grasp with what I am moving us towards here, with what I see in the scripture here. And I just want to leave you with these thoughts, and I cover this in my exposition of Revelation chapter 4 in the next session of Revelation, that could it be, is it possible that the difference in the description that we read between the Ezekiel passage of the cherubim and the passages of Isaiah and John, where those two were both viewing this vision outside of 3 dimensions, whereas Ezekiel was viewing this vision inside 3 dimensions, that he only saw 4 wings because only 4 of the 6 wings were viewable in 3 dimensions. It's something to think about. Now, I'm not saying that's the way it is, but I'm saying it does us good to think outside of the box. In any case, I think the point is clear here, that there is so much more to reality than what we can see, what we can conceive. And God has blessed us with the ability. He's given us His Word, which gives us the ability to see beyond, to see what's above, to look around the corner, to peek behind the curtain, so to speak, and see what is really real. And thus, it should help us and it should calibrate us to live with eternity in mind, because that's where we are going. Every person who's put their faith in Jesus Christ, because He's the one who shed His blood so that we might have this opportunity, so that we might even understand the words of God. And what a great blessing. And imagine the displeasure we will see on the Lord's face if when we arrive at the Bema seat, we've had all of these opportunities presented to us, all of this delivered to us to engage and to calibrate how we live our lives, and we've done nothing with it. It hasn't really changed us, or it has just become a theoretical, intellectual exercise. We have this opportunity, and the cost was tremendous. It was the shed blood of Christ who made all of this possible for us. Well, if you're watching this and you have not thought these things through, there is the one central question, the one central person that you have to reconcile yourself with, is who is Jesus Christ to you? Have you received Him as your Lord and Savior? That's the doorway. He is the only mediator between man and God. He is your only entrance into this fantastic, wonderful realm that is beyond our capacity to understand. And so think about it and reach out to someone who is a friend if you've not made the decision on what you're going to do with Jesus Christ. With that said, I am going to end this session, and God bless and have a good day.